John Jackson Miller. I am the founder and curator of Comicron.com, the world's largest public database of comic book sales figures. And I wanted to take a look back this video at April 1998. As I record this, it's exactly 20 years before. And it's just a good snapshot of what was going on in the market in this period, which is still smack in the middle of the 7-year collapse of the business that followed the bursting of the bubble market, the sort of the credit bubble market that we had in the early 1990s. By April 1998, we were exactly 1 year following the closing of Heroes World Distribution, which was the last rival distributor to Diamond, and it had been the one that was carrying Marvel Comics exclusively. By this point, we have now had 1 year of more or less stability where after the distributor wars, we only have one distributor carrying everything, and it's sort of a one-stop shop experience for retailers. And the number of comic shops is still continuing to decline as a result of everything that has happened at this point in this decade. And so, as noted here, the top 300 are off 25% this month versus the previous April. And that's 25% in units, 20% in dollars year to or 20% in units year to date, and 17% in dollars year to date. These numbers here as 7 million copies in the top 300. That's an interesting figure because that's kind of about the average that we would be at for most of the 2000s and 2010s. It's just we would get to that number a lot differently. Here, there's only about 250 comics that are selling over 3,000 copies. Most of the copies that reflected in the charts are coalesce here at the top of the table. And indeed, we have 8 comics over the 100,000 mark, and 2 over 140. It was not unusual for this part of the decade to see X-Men, Uncanny X-Men, the 2 titles going in parallel there, topping the charts. They would always top the charts if there wasn't anything else going on, like a big event. And in fact, these comics would be at the top of most of the charts at the last 2 years of the decade. We have to go down to issue the sixth comic book in the chart, Superman Forever Collector's Edition, to get to the first comic that is not just a regular issue of a series. This is just not a period where it's dominated by first issues and events. Superman Forever Collector's Edition, retailers would say that that was their best-selling book in terms of dollars for the month because, again, it was $5.95. It was just not the top unit book, which was Uncanny X-Men. Still, the comics from Marvel and DC were just under $2, the regular issues there. Couple of things that we note. The Marvel comics here, you'll begin to see them peter out on the charts after about 100th place. That's because they just didn't exist. Marvel, which was coming back from bankruptcy, had a comic slate that was much reduced. Just 51 copies or 51 comics were released in April of 1998. DC had 20 more come out, and not all the comics that Marvel had on this chart actually came out on time. And this is one reason that DC had, just right around this time, encouraged Diamond to begin releasing the final order charts market shares. This is where they took the charts, they added all the reorders that they got, they added all the graphic novels, and then they threw out everything that didn't have an actual release, anything that was later out of the month. And the result was that DC led Marvel here 25% to 23%. If we just look at the chart itself, we see that Marvel leads DC in both units and dollars. But again, as noted, this chart does include comics that didn't come out. It doesn't include reorders, and it doesn't include the graphic novels. I'll get to the graphic novels in a minute, but wanted to quickly look at some interesting releases that are in the comics chart here. We have to go down to let's see, where is it? Oh yes, Battle Chasers 1, 13th place is the first real regular release that's coming out from Image here, and we get Battle Chasers leading later on in the year. It'll actually top the charts. So this is the beginning of something for that series. There just aren't a lot of series like it. I mean, look at how few number ones we have in the chart. The next number one that we get to is also sort of another interesting snapshot of what's going on in the business. A lot of the comic shops in the 1990s were kept solvent by Magic the Gathering and the other collectible card games that came out in the wake of it, following its real boom, which was in 1994. I was following this because Comics Retailer Magazine ended up turning into Comics and Games Retailer Magazine during this decade because it was such a big deal. And then also I was editing Scry Magazine later on too, which was the guide to collectible card games. By 1998, the Magic wave, the whole fad aspect of it had kind of played out to a degree, and 1998 only had a handful of new collectible card games release. One of them was from Jim Lee. It was C23, and this was something where it was a combination collectible card game and comic book, or rather, at least the comic book was going to be released in parallel with the card game, and would be generating a lot of content that would be then used in the card game. It did not set the world on fire, and in fact, it was not until the next year, 1999. That collectible card games would once again help the comics industry, and that was because of the boom in Pokemon, which really was a huge phenomenon. We have a Battle Chasers Chromium Edition show up here at 69th place. So just some other interesting things here. As noted, we run out of Marvel and DC comics relatively early in the charts. The lower ranking DC comics are more likely to be Vertigo books. This is Nevada. I think that's Steve Gerber. We get the end of Kitchen Sink happening around now. This is Spirit: The New Adventures. This is a resolicitation of that issue. This is Spirit's New Adventures series was really the end of Kitchen Sink's run. It was the last title that it had that made any kind of a dent. As we get further down here, we just start running out of the big publishers' titles. These days, around 300th place, or in later years, around 300th place, you'd see comics in this ranking doing 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, sometimes even 6,000 copies. Just not the case in this era. There weren't as many publishers in the game, or at least their slates were not as big at the time. One curious thing to note here, you'll see that where we're listing the dollar rankings, once we get to 250th place, we don't have specific rankings anymore. That's because Diamond only released dollar rankings for the top 250, but they did give everyone the unit sales rankings and information to be able to figure out what those comics sold from 251st to 300th place. Speaking of Diamond and rankings, this was the first month, April 1998, that Diamond began releasing the index sales figures for the top 25. They had been doing just the top 10. It became a much bigger part of the business, so now we got to see the top 25. Later on, that number would increase and increase and increase all the way out to 500. But just at this stage, it's still an evolving thing, and the category is an evolving definition for Diamond, as evidenced by the fact that we have kind of a dumping grounds here for a lot of things that are just priced above $5 or $6. That Superman collector's edition made the comics part of the charts, but we have a number of things that are very clearly comic books here, like Verotic Illustrated 3, Walt Disney's Comics and Stories 625, Uncle Scrooge 310. These are just larger comic books with spines on them, regular issues of the series that wound up down here because they were kind of sorting it by price. There's even a Dynamic Forces cover in here, variant cover. To get to the first true graphic novel, we're probably looking at Sympathy for the Devil here, collected trade paperback edition from Oh My Goddess, or the Justice League hardcover here is going to be our first hardcover. And we're finally getting to see some numbers on these things. So what we find is that the top 25 graphic novels ended up having sales worth a little less than $1 million. That's a significant addition, and it would just become bigger in the months and years to come. Let's give a quick look at 1998 overall, and we'll see that even though there was a period in the middle of the year where we began to think that things would be improving somewhat. I even wondered if we had hit a floor in the market, and wrote an article in Comics Buyer's Guide with sort of a question mark at the end of it saying, is this the great comic book comeback finally? It turned out it would not be, and we had a couple more years to go for the collapse of the business. April and May did not help matters. Even so, we wound up a little bit better than April's track record, down 16% for the year in units, in copies sold, and down 14% in dollars. Although, again, the graphic novel category did improve. Part of the problem simply was that Marvel had not yet thrown in heavily to the graphic novel side of things. DC had committed more to it. Marvel, one of its sales representatives, had famously said that the company was not in the inventory keeping business, and was not prepared to have a big backlist yet. That would begin to change, and also Marvel would get back to publishing more comics than just 40 or 50 a month, and that would help things out. But at this period, still, it is very slow going. Later on in the year, we would get the launch of Fathom. Witchblade Tomb Raider would be the top-selling comics of the year. But most of the comics you'll see are just regular issues of Uncanny X-Men and Uncanny X-Men, and when you get down to the top comic every month of the year, it's X-Men, 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 with just a few exceptions there. In fact, 1999 will be mostly X-Men in these charts again. And there was time yet to go. Really, it was Battle Chasers that was probably the biggest new series edition of this year. That and Fathom, and there was just a ways to go yet before we got to that. This is still an interesting period. We have stores that are hanging in there. It's notable that while 84, 85 million copies a year is about what we're doing these days in 2017, 2018, as I record this in 2018, we're getting to that point with fewer stores than we had in 1998. So the stores themselves are selling more copies overall individually than they did then. They're sort of the per capita sales have increased, and of course the major difference is that there's a whole lot more revenue coming in from graphic novels, trade paperbacks, than we had back then. But this is something where you can take a look at any individual month or year on Comicron. You just go to the monthly sales page at the tabs on every page there, and we at this recording we just have a couple of months from 93 and 94 up, but we have 95 onward every single month from Diamond, and we will eventually have a lot more figures from both Diamond going further back into the past, and also from other distributors, and then other data sets completely. So this has been sort of a look back at the past, at April 1998, And until next time, we'll see you in the comic shop.